you guys, but thank you, thank you. So our next speaker, wow, I'm so impressed. I don't know, I just like, wow, wow, wow. Our next speaker today is Richard Sharpe, and a little bit of about Richard Sharpe before we get into the present. So Richard, again, has been a human rights advocate for 30 years. 30 years, both at community and institutional level. Until recently, he has worked with the Canadian Federal Public Services, where he held several national positions representing employees as both union rep as well as a leader in the employee-led organization. He is currently the director of the Black Equity Branch Treasury Secretariat at the Ontario Public Service. His work regionally and nationally is intended to improve the conditions of Black and African diaspora in the communities in Canada. So yeah, Richard, thank you. Take over. I think you might be on mute, Richard. Yeah, I don't see the microphone. I don't think your microphone might be connected, or the headset might not be connected, because I don't see a microphone here at my end. So I see one hand up. Darlene, maybe we'll come back to you after Richard's presentation. Sorry about that. I missed that, Darlene. So yeah, Richard, maybe if you want to even log off, come back in and see if that will work. So Richard, I think, is logged off. Hopefully when he comes back, his microphone should work. Darlene, if you have a quick question, you want to quickly jump in until the time Richard joins us. If you want to unmute yourself and. You there, Darlene? I'm not sure, Darlene, if you are speaking, and maybe you are on mute. Okay, let's try that. Darlene, are you there? Let me see if I can unmute. Yeah, so Darlene, go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hi, yeah, you have to excuse me. I have a bad chest cold thing here going on, but yeah, I just had more questions about the second last slide from the previous speaker.
Okay.
And just more, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, strategies for PTSD. Okay. They had put some on there, like creating a quiet space, providing choices to clients, you know, or self. And yeah, I don't have that screen in front of me.
Yeah. All right, so let's do this, Darlene. Let Richard complete his slide, and maybe during the break, if Lindsay and Catherine can quickly kind of answer your question, or maybe put some link in the chat for you. Would that be okay, Darlene?
Yeah, that would be good. I thought you were asking pertaining to the previous speakers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. I did, but Richard is here, and let's hear Richard, and then maybe during the break we'll get some time to catch up in terms of our question, if you're okay with that.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, Darlene. All right, Richard, can you say something? Let's just see if it's working.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Oh,
testing.
yes, you are in business. Please, Richard, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I was saying when you couldn't hear me that your introduction about me being around for doing this work for 30 years makes me feel really old. But I have to say that I'm still having a really good time. This is important work, and I'm happy to be here today. I did want to talk a little bit, and I don't have slides today because I'm hoping that it will be a bit more of a conversation and a back and forth, which tend to be a bit more engaging for me, at least, around anti-Black racism in the justice system and its impacts on the people who are part of the justice system, or I will say the legal system, because I don't see that there's, even though I've been working at the Department of Justice for a couple of years as an executive pushing this work, I see a distinction between justice systems and legal systems. Because justice systems means you have redress and that people come out of the other end whole and with issues addressed, and they have their humanity. And legal systems oftentimes do a whole bunch of different things, but don't always uphold the human rights or equity of individuals. So I did want to talk a little bit about the difference between the two, or just talk about, you know, what justice is supposed to do, or justice systems are supposed to do. I think that most people believe that justice systems are in place to keep people safe, to keep us safe from the bad guys. So police go out there and they round up the bad guys, and they, you know, we can walk the streets without worrying about getting mugged or things taken away from us or being harmed. But is this actually the function of, say, policing and the justice system? Do we actually keep everybody safe, or do we keep some people safe and do harm to others? And I think that that is what precedes a lot of the conversations that I've been having within the systems of the federal government and now the provincial government, where I'm the director of the Black Equity Branch, a remarkable and historic creation of an institutional office and body to address longstanding issues of anti-Black racism within the Ontario Public Service, work that I had hoped to do and was trying to work with federal officials to have put in place in the federal public service before I left, but that's yet another story. So certainly from my perspective and my years of doing this work, I see that justice doesn't actually necessarily keep people safe, but it has a different function. And that function is oftentimes to maintain control and to maintain a level of status quo in terms of power within a society. So, you know, and who are the people who are the most impacted by power and the status quo? Oftentimes, and we see this through a number of statistical data analysis from Stats Canada to research and other findings, that people of African descent, Indigenous people in this country, are the most negatively impacted by the justice system. It is, and this is, and this starts from, you know, they say cradle to grave. The school to prison pipeline, as they call it, for Black folk in particular, where people are identified within the systems of education, systems of policing, the carceral system, policings of taxing and all that sort of thing, gears particular groups in our society to be less well off and actually to feel, I think, oftentimes marginalized and targeted by these systems. I'm going to give you a little mini history lesson because I don't want to bore people with some of this stuff. But when we talk about, for example, the origins of policing, the origins of policing in Canada, and this is, and I would say, pre-1834, which was the emancipation of enslavement of African peoples in the Commonwealth countries. Canada had a police force that was here to help maintain and support the colonialism of this land, the RCMP and the organization that preceded the Ontario Provincial Police, in particular in what was called Upper Canada, were charged with making sure that enslaved Africans were not straying too far away from their owners, and that they carried their identity papers so that people could identify where they belonged. So that practice of identity papers and became modern day carding. And so even though it's a human rights violation and it's been expressed as a human rights violation by dozens of people, it's still really hard to undo, because this is the raison d'etre. This is why our policing was put in place. And so if you're founded to do one thing, it is difficult to modernize and have it change without changing its purpose, without changing its foundational purpose. There are folks that would like us to, continue with the good old days, but that hasn't worked for a large and growing number of our members of our society who are the fastest growing populations in Canada right now are Black and Indigenous communities. So Canada is going to be a very different place in 30 years. There's going to be a lot more people running around doing this work. I hopefully will be well retired by then and sitting on a beach somewhere, while my children and my grandchildren, I hope, are not still doing this work. But I'm not holding my hopes out just yet. I would also want to talk about the justice system. So what we call the justice system, the foundations of the justice system, the Department of Justice Canada, was founded over 189, maybe 190 years ago as the first federal department. And it's pretty much its first order of business was to legalize the colonization of this country and to put in laws and regulations to keep certain people out and to justify enslavement and later on segregation, similar to what we had in Jim Crow US, within the Canadian population, that we normalize this, we bake this into our laws. So in order to do that, there's needed to be systems of education and indoctrination supported by the church at the time to help to justify marginalizing and keeping sort of Black and Indigenous people down. So this has had an impact because this is our founding fathers, if you want to call them, the European colonizers, the settlers of this place. The first prime minister said, we have to make sure that Canada is white and keeping Asians and other people out. This foundation became what we have now today. The leftovers of that, the vestiges of that, is what we have to deal with today. So what we're seeing in terms of communications, what we're seeing in almost every facet of our lives is an undertone of anti-Blackness that impacts on the policy and the program development and the implementation within all sectors of our lives. The United Nations came to Canada in 2015 and 2016 to do the Human Rights Council, to do some work on assessing the state of people of African descent in this country. And they were opened up, the doors opened up. Well, we have multiculturalism and we have employment equity, we have human rights legislation, things are good, Black people are happy. But what the UN found in this investigation, in this study, and these conversations, was that anti-Black racism is so embedded in the fabric of Canada that it is normalized. It is normal for 20% of Black boys not to graduate from high school. It is normal to have 3 times the overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal, in the carceral system. It is normal for people to perceive that Black people are criminals and rapists and doing all kinds of other criminal activity. And that is baked into the thinking of the people who run these policies and programs and so on. So if we have these things that have been taught to us quietly, informally, and politely since we were small, to when we become adults and we're working in these institutions, it is obvious as to why we're seeing such high rates of, and we're seeing it now as numbers grow within our workplaces of complaints of discrimination, of workplace discrimination, of harassment, and illness. And I appreciated the comments of the previous presenters who were talking about trauma, the vestiges of this, the impacts of living in a society. And I was born in Canada, so I know, I could tell you stories from my childhood up until today. The impacts of this on people is deep-seated trauma. And I would say generational trauma, because we pass this trauma down to our children and our grandchildren who continue to face exactly the same things. That trauma can be debilitating. It creates all forms of dysfunction and dysfunctional behavior, as was discussed in the previous presentation, illness, and other forms of harm. So, and in fact, one of the sort of remarkable things, and people, because I end up dealing with so much of this harm, I think I'm hardwired not to be impacted as much by it. but the cycles of violence and the cycles of hurt and pain transcend, like I said, generations. So my father was a university educated, master's educated teacher from Oxford University in England. When he came here, couldn't find a job for like 25 years. That impacted us economically. It impacted my mom, who had to become the breadwinner without a high school education. It impacted the 6 of us children in terms of our socioeconomic status. It impacted our ability to go to school. It impacted our ability to go to university. It impacted our ability to get work. It took me much longer as a Black man to get work in this society because of the injustices that were sort of baked into it. So because I look at the source of problems, and I could talk all day about the symptoms and the impacts of it, but I like to talk about solutions. And talking about solutions for me means to embrace others within this work. After the murder of George Floyd, and where we saw in that 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the extinguishing of Black life under the knee of a white supremacist agent of the state in the US, we all realize that this is what happens to us as Black people, not just when we encounter policing, but in all of these other institutions that we face in one way, shape, or another. So we do so, some of us try to do it with grace, and some of us can't, right? And so the ones that can't oftentimes are the ones that get ensnared within our justice systems. And so it's with that understanding that these are systems that can harm. These are systems that have continually harmed, and that many people don't see it. It requires work at a really deep-seated level. It requires work, like I said, with co-conspirators, not just allies, to reset things, if not reimagine what policing looks like, what justice systems look like. I spent a lot of time over the last couple of years supporting something called the UN International Decade for People of African Descent. I don't know if anybody on this call has heard of the UN Decade. It started in 2015 and goes to 2024. So next year is the end of the decade. This is similar to the International Decade for people, for Indigenous peoples that preceded it. It's been pretty quiet in Canada, as much as many of us have been pushing for it, but pushing for it to instill some of the pillars of the decade, which spoke to recognition, justice, and development. I stayed in government just so that I could work on this file, or try to push this file with senior levels of government, because I understood that if we can make some changes at an institutional level, the lives of people who look like me would be better. Wasn't entirely successful. I think that there's a need for an extension of another 10 years, the decade. But what I will say is that one of the and what relates back to this conference, one of the big pieces of the initiatives that we were pushing forward, myself and other community folks and folks in government, is a Black Canadian justice strategy, or so a Black Canadian justice strategy that's hinged on the fact and the knowledge and the data that Black people are not being served by justice system at multiple levels. We saw recently that even at the Human Rights Commission, has been harming Black employees, or has found to be harming Black employees. And so all the things that we were saying for the last 20 years about the Human Rights Commission not serving our communities, and now the chickens have come home to roost, and now we're seeing that this is the case. And if one of the most prestigious institutions in this country that speaks to human rights has failed us, then what do you think about all the other institutions in this country that are sort of linking up to the Human Rights Commission? So a justice strategy is critically important. And why I raise this is that, in my estimation, that this work has stalled in a way that we've lost sight of what actually needs to be done in terms of the outcomes that we're looking for. In my past life, I was a manager of performance measurement for one of the largest departments in federal public services and procurement Canada. And I know full well that if you measure and you set outcomes that are ambitious, and that you set a number of metrics behind it, that you will work towards achieving the results of that of the initiative or of the change, right? So for me, and I think for countless others, Black activists, policy analysts, and even people who are not part of the Black community, what we were hoping for was that the justice strategy itself could serve as a means of relooking at how justice is meted out within this country, at least at the federal level, and impact the provinces as well, because the provinces and the feds have a symbiotic relationship as it pertains to how justice, the discipline of justice is meted out to, for, and against people. But a systemic approach that speaks to things like, looking at the history, as the previous speakers were stating, like look at the history of trauma on folks who are still struggling with trauma. This is history of over-policing, the history of enslavement, the history of slave catching, the over-proliferation of negative stereotypes within our society about Black people, how that impacts on jurors, on judges, and all of the justice of the peace, and all of these people that impact on the lives of our people, that we need to look at something similar to a GLADU recommendations to support Indigenous people and always have an Indigenous lens, that our justice system needs to have a Black lens that takes into consideration all of those things that I have stated, so that at the end of the day, what we come out is actually exercises and actually restorative justice, a reparatory justice, when it comes to the treatment of Black people who, as I keep saying, have been ensnared in the system since they were small. Just a couple of stories before I shut down my talk, because I could talk all day about this kind of stuff, is that I have 3 children that I love dearly. I think, in fact, it's absolutely true. I came out of retirement to come back into this work because my son was experiencing challenges in school. And at one point in 2017, he was suspended for challenging a teacher for a principal for racially profiling him. It actually made the news. And there's a Toronto Star article about Mandela and his travails and actually success, because he overcame some of those challenges. But part of those conversations around my children is that we knew that our children would be targeted from the time that they set foot into a school. And it was exactly right. At grade 2, he was targeted. He was too athletic. He was too talkative. He all asked too many questions. They found that he was not cooperative. He always wanted to play outside with the ball. And so that became a problem. So much so that we ended up deciding to take him out of school because we found that wasn't a safe place for him, and we homeschooled him for 5 years. Asked him what he wanted to do with his life. He said he wanted to be a professional soccer player at 7 years old. And we said, well, get yourself an education, we'll see what happens. Long story short for him is that he's now playing semi-professional soccer in Toronto as we speak, having gone through the university system and now taking his chances in that space. But many of his peers are in prison. Many of his peers are unwell. Many of his peers that he went to school with have not succeeded in their lives, partly because of how they were also treated in those systems. So I say that because of how deeply this runs. When we're talking about justice, reparatory justice, and systems, that we're not just talking, and when we're talking about a justice strategy, we're not just talking about the justice system itself, but we're also needing to talk about all of those things that feed into the justice system: education, child welfare, the healthcare system, policing, of course, right? All of these things kind of line things up when these things, housing, when these things are not working for us. And I know because of my dad's situation, we grew up in poverty, and I was this close to becoming a criminal mastermind, trying to take over the world, which probably would have gotten me either killed or in prison. But all that to say is that all of these things make up a just society. And if we actually believe in this concept of a just society, then we actually have to do the work. And I think oftentimes we don't. We leave it to other people who are mandarins of justice, mandarins of this or that, to come up with these ideas and policy recommendations and programs for us without actually being part of that work and asking the right questions. Is this data informed? Are we including the people who are the most impacted by these policies and programs? And what are the outcomes that we want to achieve from these initiatives? Will they bear fruit in de-escalating the amount of crime that we see? Will they bear fruit in terms of not over-policing or over-targeting or over-ensnaring Black and Indigenous people into our justice systems? In many ways, it's interesting to me that now that I'm doing work on the international stage, I went to the UN Geneva in December to support the first permanent forum for people of African descent. I was asked to attend by a couple of UN fellows and continue to do work in this space. It's interesting to me that how much Canada's treatment of Black people is known across the diaspora in other member states. So this is an issue for Canada, not just domestically in terms of our souls as people who live here, but it also will impact us in terms of our desire to engage with those member state countries and countries on the continent, that new frontier of opportunity, wealth, in terms of resources, both human and mineral and so on, that we need to think about how we treat our people here who are the direct descendants. We're considered the sixth region from the continent, those who are from the diaspora. So I think it's really important and incumbent on us to get this stuff right, not just for sort of the economic reasons and the political reasons, but also for to ensure that we as a society can maintain our collective humanity. And that's a difficult and long conversation to have, because I think many of us know that what I'm talking about is true, and that it seems very difficult and overwhelming to address, but in actuality, it's a one step at a time thing, and it requires us to sort of recognize and face the reality that we live in a society that practices anti-Black racism through its justice system. So I'll end there. Again, I'm happy to be part of a conversation, answering the questions that I can. I kind of skirted over stuff. I wasn't giving people numbers and that kind of stuff because that really bores people. But I'm really interested to hear what people have to think on some of the things that I said, and hoping that this conversation goes beyond just a talk and translates into folks willing to work with, I would say, like minds to address some of these challenges that we have within our systems for the betterment of our societies. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, Richard, thank you. I'm seeing something in the chat. There are some questions. All right, so whoever wants to ask questions, please raise your hand. In the sense, raise your hand. Under the reaction, there is a function there, raise hand. If you can click that and ask questions or put something in the chat. And there is one question here. It says, Richard, I love that you call it out. You call it the legal system and not the justice system. I do as well. So this is just a comment there for you, Richard. And then I'm needing to know if so if you, what happens is by default, everyone is muted. But if you have a question, please, use that raise hand feature and I'll unmute you. Please feel free to ask questions. Until the time there are some hands up. For me, Richard, the way I kind of looked at when I heard you, it reminded me, a friend of mine was complaining, about the police brutality. And he said, what's wrong with these police? And my response to him was, there's nothing wrong with the police. I think the system is working as designed. I think a lot of people kind of look at these different, the Children's Aid Society you talk about the police, you talk about even the whole criminal justice system. A lot of times people seems to think that these are just a few bad apples. My take, I totally agree with you. I think the system itself is rotten. There's nothing wrong with the system. I think, as you said, right, if you look historically, the whole carding system, right? It was designed basically to control and contain, right? Both indigenous and Black communities. So it's the same system that's being passed on to us. So we should not be surprised that it's, anyway, those are some thoughts that came to my mind. I don't know, Richard, if you want to kind of elaborate.
Oh yeah, yeah, and people shouldn't be afraid to ask questions. I really don't bite, or at least not too hard. I totally agree with you in that because these systems have been constructed in such a way, and that we believe that it's normal. We really do. I believed it was normal when I was growing up. I believe that it was normal for Black people to be more like criminals. I remember I learned how to pick locks because I saw it on TV, and I was grade 6, and I learned how to pick locks until I realized there was a room that was locked, a storeroom at school, and we didn't have a key. And I go, oh, I can open that key. And just as I was about to stick that pin in there, I said, wait a minute. If anything goes missing from this room, I'm going to be blamed in the future. And I made that calculus quick. I was a smart kid. And I said, you know what? I actually don't know how to pick this lock. And I think that from that moment on, I decided not to play into those stereotypes. And so that created problems for me. If I ended up showing up, not to belabor it, but if I ended up showing up in math class and saying that to my math teacher and say, I want to take calculus, they were like, well, no, Richard, that calculus is too difficult for you. I think you need to go into like, the B side, right? Take easier math. And because you're playing basketball, Richard, you can't do calculus as well. So that stuff, I ended up having to fight that kind of stuff is when I was growing up. You're a smart kid, but people have expectations of you not to be able to achieve. So when I'm pulled over by a police officer, and it's not if, it's when, I'm driving a nice car, I have to make a calculus that when he sees me and he sees the hair, that he's got a stereotype in his mind about the kind of person that I am. So I have to talk as white as possible, as slowly and as clearly as possible. And I look him in the eye, it's oftentimes a guy, and I explain to him and I ask him the right questions. I read his badge number back to him. I do all of those things to keep me safe, hands on the steering wheel, because I have to be on guard. So it's interesting to me, like what you said, the systems are all around us, and it forces us, many of us, to code switch all the time, or to be on guard all the time. And that creates stress and trauma for people. And so I understand when people fall ill. We have higher rates of infant mortality, higher rates of cancer, higher rates of this in Canada and the United States. But when we go to other countries like West Africa, where they have sometimes hunger and famine, they don't have those kinds of chronic illnesses, right? And they have McDonald's and Burger King too. So it's like, it's not that it's the diet, it is stress and the environment that we live in that's harmful to us. And that is underpinned by legal frameworks, it's underpinned by societal norms that we must change. One more thing real quick, and because I know, because the space that I've been working in is around data analytics, the human condition, both in Canada and globally. I know what's coming for Canada. Canada's future is Black and brown, and there's not very much people can do about it. I know right now we have preference for people coming over from Europe, from that, European tribal conflict. The future, the largest group of people that are coming into this country are people from the African country. The continent of Africa will be the most populous place. People who look like me currently make up around 10, 11% of the global population. In 30 years, a quarter of the people will come who look like me will be coming from the continent. So that's going to cause an enormous pressure on Canada in terms of migration, because our populations here are shrinking. China's population is shrinking. India is surpassing China, right? Same with Europe. So the people that you need to keep your economy going are going to look like me. And you cannot with any kind of sense of self-preservation, treat people, the descendants of these people, like second-class citizens when they come here, or they will decide not to come, or they will not send their best, or when they're here, they will de-invest in this place and invest someplace else. I have to say that I'm in that mindset. I've been here for more than 55 years on this earth. And when I see my children are not being able to thrive, I'm looking elsewhere. And I will take all the resources and money and so on with me, and so will we, if it means that I have a better chance of life and prosperity for my children than to stay here in the country of my birth and be treated like this until I die. That's unacceptable. So if we want that change, I'm not the only one. There's so many others, especially professionals, that got to think about what's the future hold, and is this the right place for us? Policy, programs, basically basic human rights need to be respected in a way that safeguards our collective humanity. And that maybe is another discussion about that, because I think that this work is harmful when I'm being discriminated against, and white people and other racialized people are walking by. They own some of that, and my dehumanization means that they are basically being dehumanized as well. That guilt that can be so dangerous as well. But I mean, like, we have an opportunity here, a remarkable opportunity in this sort of historic moment where people were kind of woke, and woke in a real woke way, not like some of the conservative pundits have been so-called anti-woke movement. But woke means that you're aware and you respect other people who are different from you, and you understand the history around why things are the way they are. You're alive to the realities of their condition. But if more people are in that space, that I think we can actually achieve change.
Totally. And Richard, there is one more quick question, but before I get to that question, I think what you just said about this global competition for the brains, because we are living in an information technology, age of information technology, people across Europe are competing for the best minds. Canada, I think, will not have a choice but to, as you said, to relax rules, to treat people with respect and dignity, because otherwise, as you said, they'll pack their bags and go to Germany, go to other countries, especially in our technical kind of a world in which we're living, right? It's this globalized world, and technology and minds. These are what everybody on earth is competing for. So Canada will not have the luxury of cherry picking, because these people are going to pack their bags, as you said, and leave and go elsewhere. So yeah, I don't think we have that kind of luxury. One last question is what's the best way we as service provider for us to address anti-Black racism and anti-indigeneity within the community of justice programs?
Oh, that's a great question. The first thing you need to do is find out who the people are in those communities that you need to bring in to co-design and co-develop any policies and programs that are directed to those communities. If I sit in a room and I try to develop policies and programs for women, even if they're Black women, I'm going to fail. I don't know what being a Black woman or a white woman or any woman is like. So you need to bring them in. And when you bring people in the spirit of co-development and co-design, you have the possibility to create something special that you may not even have thought of possible. Because the energy of the people that you bring in, it's a big self-interest for them, for them to be there. That's the first thing that you need to do. Maybe the second thing, or maybe in tandem, is to educate yourselves on the issues that impact on those communities in relation to your service provision. So whatever area that you're working in, how are Blacks and Indigenous people interacting with those systems? Do you have data that disaggregates the experiences of Black or Indigenous people? And can you use that data and that information to be able to come up with initiatives or directions or strategies to continually improve the experience? And I think that if you do those things in terms of bringing folks in from those communities, do some education work on your own or with others, and to develop metrics and data sets around that work, you're on your way. There's no stopping.
Okay, so thank you, Richard. Amazing conversation. I think we need to have more of these brave conversations and courageous conversations. I think this is what will help, I think, all of us in the sense of, as you said, to humanize, uh, you know, both our mainstream white cultures as well as, people with lived experiences who are on the receiving end of all of these institutional practices that are harmful, I think, to both of these communities. So thank you, Richard. I'm looking at the time. It's 10:30. I think it's time for us to maybe take a quick break. Darlene, I have you in mind in terms of your question. I'm not sure I can. I don't know if. Kathy, in terms of your question, if you could even maybe write something in the chat, your question, or maybe in the question itself, directly to our panelist. So for the rest of you, please feel free, take a break, stretch, get out, leave your room, walk around. I don't know, take a coffee, lunch break, whatever you want to do, a 15-minute break. Let's all come back at 11:45. Darlene, if you want to stay and post your question in the chat, I can pick it up and pass it on to the panelist, and then we'll kind of take it up from there. All right. So I'm going to stay for a few more minutes. For the rest of you, please, leave yourself logged on and just walk out and kind of. Darlene, you're still there?
Did Darlene have a question for me?
No, this was for the previous, I think,
Okay.
for the previous
Okay.
presenter. Yeah. Thank you,
Okay.
Richard.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. So I don't know, Darlene, if you're still around, let me see if maybe just post your question. I can pass it on to the panelist. Sorry, we're running short of time, so that's why I'm kind of hurrying up. I just want to make sure that each speaker gets their time. So this is what's driving me in terms of the conversations.